Well, the government released the draft of the revised data protection bill for public consultation on November 18th. Now, we are now nearing the deadline of December 17th for public comments. But as the debate on the draft bill rages on, critics have sounded alarm bells for the RTI Act. But why are information activists concerned? Well, they are citing portions of the draft data protection bill, which they believe will dilute the RTI Act. In fact, the draft bill proposes an amendment that bars release of any personal information about public servants or elected leaders, including their assets, service records, or even disciplinary action that may have been initiated. But first, before we come to that, here is Nandan Nilekani, the brains behind the Aadhaar regime, as well as the key architect of the Digital India mission, supporting the new data protection bill in an exclusive conversation with CNBC TV18.
The earlier draft, because there's so many suggestions, it had become bulkier and bulkier, and it had so many clauses.
Yeah.
And I think they decided, rather than take that, they said, let's take that learning, come back with a much more succinct and much more thoughtful version. I think this is the right approach. Get a good framework law in place, and then as you go forward, either through regulation or other subsidiary legislation, you can add more things.
Well, we'll get you more of that exclusive conversation with Nandan Nilekani later on the broadcast. But for now, let's go across to Mr. Yashwardhan Azad, former Information Commissioner, as well as former IPS officer, who is joining us today. Mr. Azad, thank you so much for taking our time to speak to us on CNBC TV18. First question, as you heard Mr. Nandan Nilekani, this is a bill that, in fact, is simple, is uncomplicated. That's the government's pitch, that the earlier version had 90 sections. This one is shortened down to 30. It is innovation-friendly. That's the story that the government is trying to put forth. Your narrative, however, is a bit different. Tell us, from your experience as a CIC, as an information commissioner, what is your key takeaway when you look at this draft bill out for public consultation?
Well, let me say at the very outset, of course, there are some welcome features. It's written in a very simple fashion, and I think that's very important for communication with the public. It has only 30 clauses, it has illustrations, and thank God for not using those words, apropos or notwithstanding, ceteris paribus, and all those things. So in that respect, yes, it's very good. Also, the data localization, which was being debated very hotly earlier, that has also been clarified. You can have it in safe geographies. So these are welcome features. But then I would have a number of comments, you see. The first is, if you're talking from the RTI point of view, it's very clear. You see, the RTI Act, which was passed in 2004, I think it was a sunshine legislation. Sunshine legislation because we were talking in the preamble about transparency and accountability. What does that mean? That means that your mission against corruption has to be fortified with an act. Now what is happening is the exemption part, which is in Section 8 of the RTI, there is a particular exemption which says anything personal which has no relation to any public activity, etc., purely private, cannot be given unless in public interest. What does public interest mean? A corruption case, for example, is an interest to society or to the nation. And that is why anything about the, disproportionate assets, anything about, ACRs, the number of ACRs at least, the probity of public servants, these are to be given. Today, what is happening is that even already the MLA-led scheme in which the money is given, the beneficiaries, that is not being given. So once you have this section removed, apparently the fight against corruption will slow down. And that is a very, very important thing. Secondly, it says that it will override any other act. Now, if it overrides the Right to Information Act, then it's going to be a serious problem. So I think on these two counts, the agitators are rightly agitated, and especially activists of the RTI. But I have a number of other suggestions also. For example, if you have such an important bill which is coming up, which is going to be enacted as a legislation, then in the bill itself, you should give the nature of the constitution of the Data Protection Board. Mind you, all over the world, the terminology is being used what? It's called Data Protection Authority, because authority designates a kind of a status arrogated to that board. Now, once you make it a board, it looks like another executive
Sure.
body. So, the clarity is not there in terms
Sure.
of details. That's another thing which I wanted to talk about, Data Protection Board. There are, of course, a number of other things
Sure.
which
So
which
in layman
relate.
terms, Mr. Azad, in layman terms, what you're saying essentially is, in layman terms, what you're suggesting essentially is that the RTI Act, Section 8, provided for non-release of personal information unless there is a pressing public cause or public interest. What this bill seeks to do, the draft data protection bill, which is out in the public domain, what it seeks to do under Section 32 is that it removes the secondary part of that clause and saying that as an overall, personal information regarding elected leaders or about MLAs will not be released even if there's a pressing public interest. So that's the change that is being sought to be made. The question then I want to put across to you is, Mr. Azad, one concern that the government has always put across in the public domain is that no fundamental right is absolute. Now, privacy, we understand, is a fundamental right, but if the government's contention is to be believed, then no fundamental right is absolute. It can be subject to reasonable restrictions. So can a case be made that, look, public interest, if an information is released, even if it is personal in nature, if a broader public interest is being served, then therefore that's a reasonable restriction?
I mean, anything. I would say, whether it's a public representative, even it's a private person, anything hurting the interests of the society or nation, there is no privacy involved in that particular case. A corrupt man, a criminal man, doesn't have any privacy because it is hurting the society, and the society needs to know what is the hurt cause. That's exactly the whole basis of this privacy scheme or any other scheme. That privacy relates to certain aspects, but not to a few things. I agree with that.
Sure. So then let me ask you a supplementary question. What is the takeaway from this? Assuming that this draft bill does in fact meet the ends of the parliamentary legislative process and is finally passed, what does that result in? Does that mean that citizens will no longer have access to data such as private assets of elected leaders or representatives of public servants? Will they not have access to complaints or assets or disciplinary action? What does it mean for the layman, for an RTI applicant?
You see, for a layman, let me tell you that even now, some of the information which needs to be in the public domain is being denied. As I told you, the beneficiaries in the MLA lad scheme or MP lad scheme are being denied. Of the PM fund, it's being denied. Even the ACRs of the IS officers was denied by the Department of Personnel. So what will happen now is that, as it is, the income tax returns, etc., are not allowed. Fine. Suppose that is supposed to be in the personal domain completely. But when it's a corruption case and you're talking, and the maximum focus in a democracy is on the probity of, public servants. So if it's a case of disproportionate assets, and if there is an inquiry and people want to know the details, there'll be no details coming out. In fact, there'll be no details coming out of anything at all, which is going to be a great damage, not only on the right to information, but to our democracy.
We're running out of time, Mr. Azad, so let me ask you one final question. The concerns that you've raised about the data protection bill, the draft version, overwhelming the RTI Act, the exemption being strengthened in a way that no personal information is disclosed, does that then mean that this could invite a possible legal challenge on the constitutionality and the legality of the draft data protection bill?
Yes, you raised a very important point. The Puttaswamy judgment, and on the basis of which the Sri Krishna Committee report had formed sent a draft bill earlier. I mean, we were talking about the legality of anything, which interferes with privacy, the proportionality, and the time limit. Now, in this case, you see what is happening is a complete carte blanche exemption has been given to the government also. So there will be questions on that count too. You have to define, you have to say exactly what is the kind of the nature of emergency. That has to be graded also. In fact, there are privacy without surveillance reforms is also an anathema. So that's another thing which needed to be discussed and ought to be discussed. So these are critical things, I think, which remain to be a question about the bill, and maybe these issues may be raised.
Sure. Right, Mr. Azad. Interesting comments, those, and it's interesting that it seems to coincide with the views that have been expressed by Justice Sri Krishna himself, who was, of course, the architect of version 1 of the data protection bill. He, too, red flagged issues of what he called was a blank check to the government in terms of exemptions and little or no clarity about the structure and the composition of the Data Protection Board, which could possibly invite challenges. But that's unfortunately all the time that we have for Mr. Azad. We'd like to thank you once again for taking your time out and for sharing your perspective. But with that, it's time now to head into a very short break. But coming up next, an interview, an exclusive conversation with Nandan Nilekani on the IT industry, startups, digital rupee, and lots more. Stay tuned.
The brains behind India's unique identification program, Aadhaar, and the architect of the Digital India mission, Nandan Nilekani, said that the government did the right thing in withdrawing the data protection bill after years of deliberation. In a freewheeling chat with me, he said that the bill was getting bulkier and bulkier and needed to be simplified. He also spoke about the central bank's attempt to launch a digital currency, the state of the startup ecosystem, what next for India in this decade, and also how the current macroeconomic environment is going to impact the IT industry. Take a look.
I think, while the global economic environment does have signs of slowing down, I think technology and the role of technology in businesses has never been higher. I think the pandemic showed us that you have to be digitally well equipped. So I do believe that there's still going to be continued interest in IT, both for transformation as well as increasingly for automation and cost reduction.
One of the biggest things to come out of technology in terms of policies has been the data protection bill. And after working on it for many years, the government withdrew it, and now it has come out with a new draft. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you make of this new version.
No, I think they have done the right thing, because the earlier draft, because there's so many suggestions, it had become bulkier and bulkier, and it had so many clauses.
Yeah.
And I think they decided, rather than take that, they said, let's take that learning, come back with a much more succinct and much more thoughtful version, which they have done. And once you have this law, then you can pass additional laws and additional regulations. But you have the basic framework. So I think this is the right approach.
But, there's been some sort of criticism, but perhaps by oversimplifying, it's coming at the cost of detail. The word "as may be prescribed" has been used about 18 times in that draft. Do you think it's going to lead to some kind of problems with interpretation because of the simplicity of the bill?
No, I don't think so. I think it's good that it's simple, and all the people who are advising me on this law said that they have that clause, but it's not, a lot of it is meant for straightforward purposes. And I think this is the right approach. Get a good framework law in place, and then as you go forward, either through regulation or other subsidiary legislation, you can add more things.
Okay, we'll see what final shape it takes. But, since you've been called the Chief Technology Officer of India, let me go ahead and ask you, you said that UPI is going to be the WhatsApp moment of India. What next now? We have the ONDC, we have the, AA, we have, a lot of other digital initiatives that are coming into play, the CBDC and so on. What do you think is going to be our next big moment?
Well, I think we are at a very interesting point. In the first part of this transformation, we had digital identity with Aadhaar, we had DBT for everybody, we had UPI to transform payments and so on. In the next phase, I think there are going to be three big things. The first is democratized credit. Everybody will get access to credit, and the account aggregator system, which has been launched, it's gathering steam.
Yeah.
Recently, GSTN was added to it. So once you make credit accessible to all, then millions of small businesses and millions of consumers will get access. That will be a big push to economic growth in an equitable manner. The second is ONDC will disaggregate commerce and make it much more inclusive, will allow more suppliers on the platform, more retailers on the platform, more consumers on the platform. So anybody can buy from anybody and so on. The third thing, I think, is the logistic revolution which is happening in India. Partly with physical infrastructure, partly with GST reforms, partly with startups. So once you improve the ability to sell, how you sell, whom you sell to, how it's delivered, and give credit to companies to grow, that's the perfect situation that you want to be in.
But how long before the account aggregator or the ONDC or the CBDC really take off in a big way? These are still early days.
Well, account aggregator has been around for, the idea has been around for 6-7 years. I think it's reached a takeoff stage. We have 1 million bank accounts that are listed on ONDC through the banks. We have more than, I think, 2 million transactions that are happening. GSTN has just been connected, has been approved as a FIP. So I think we are now at a point it will take off. ONDC also has started its pilot projects. They were launched in November in Bangalore. They are looking at that. And logistics changes are ongoing. There are so many startups. See, in all these things, it takes time to, it takes time to get all the moving parts. But once you get it going, then it just takes off. I mean, UPI in October of 2016 was 100,000 transactions, and now it's 7.3 billion transactions a month.
Well, interesting that you brought up UPI because I want to ask you about CBDC. It's just been launched. It's still in a pilot stage. The retail CBDC is out, but there are some that believe people want to use a digital currency for its convenience. Given that UPI is already quite popular, unless you want to seek anonymity with the use of an e-rupee, do you think UPI to some extent will hinder the kind of growth that CBDC could have had without something like UPI existing?
Well, I think finally it's about solving challenges and giving benefits to people. So UPI has given that benefit of zero cost instant payments. And but I think there is the anonymity benefit of CBDC. And I think over time, as people start using this, they will figure out more use cases, both on the retail side as well as on the wholesale side. For example, settlements or cross-border settlements where you have two CBDCs and you can reduce the cost of settlement between two countries and so on. See, I think fundamentally we have to realize that the RBI is one of the most progressive and forward-looking regulators there has been. I can personally say I've been working with them for 15 years. They enabled the link of Aadhaar to bank account with eKYC, then DBT with Aadhaar payment bridge, Aadhaar-enabled payment system for withdrawing money, then UPI, and now CBDC. So I think RBI has always been very forward-looking. So I think this is one more forward-looking initiative from RBI.
Okay, so we'll see how that pans out. But because we're, in the startup capital of the country, so to speak, let me also ask you about those. We're proud as a nation to be the third largest country when it comes to number of startups. We have more than 100 unicorns, but, they've raised capital in what has been a tough environment now, and we're seeing mass layoffs, restructurings, shutdowns in worst cases. How do you think the scenario is going to play out from here?
Well, I think in some sense, this is going to cleanse the system. Because, if somebody doesn't have a very viable business model and has essentially depended upon a lot of capital to build, that's no longer valid. But I think so it will force companies to become much sharper focused, much more frugal in their approach, more focused on solving real business issues. And I think at the end of this, we'll have a very good set of robust, healthy companies. So I think this will lead to a good outcome.
But do you think the situation is going to get a little worse before we see some sort of an improvement? Because, or how would you compare it to the previous cycles that we've seen, whether it was 2008, 2015, these tech booms and busts that we've seen? There is a lot of dry powder with investors, but they're a little risk averse at the moment. So where do you see light at the end of this time?
Well, we don't know how this will pan out because, the startup boom of India began only 5 years back. In 2016, we had only 1,000 startups. Now we have 90,000 startups. So the first time that the startup world has encountered this kind of challenges. So we have to see how it goes. But I think at the end of it, it will lead to a healthier, more robust, more frugal, business-oriented ecosystem.
And finally, if I may ask you, what next for you? You've donned many hats. You built the UPI. You're advising the ONDC. You're, of course, the non-executive chairperson of Infosys. What is the next big project?
No, actually, it's, many of these things are still only halfway there, so there's lots to be done. The another area which I'm partnering is I've set up a AI center at IIT Madras for AI in Indian languages called AI for Bharat. So that is another area where I think we can see some great progress in the coming years.
Okay, before I let you go, there is something we wanted to do, which is a quick question-answer session. So if you would keep your answers very brief, I have a couple of questions for you, starting with 3 things that Indian startups are doing right today.
Ambition, execution, and getting product market fit right.
What are the three things that they're doing absolutely wrong?
I think spending money to acquire customers, not being frugal enough, and not getting their product market fit right.
Are unicorns going to be a more rare sighting as they should be now?
I think maybe the numbers may come down, but anyone who becomes a unicorn now will be there because they really create a great company.
An investment that you've made which you regret?
No, I won't say anything on that.
Okay, of the many achievements that you've had, which one are you most proud of?
Well, I think it's Infosys and Aadhaar.
Okay.
Infosys, yeah, these are the two big two.
And this will be India's decade because?
Because India is in the right place at the right time, with the right energy, the right people, and the right market opportunities.
Your thoughts on cryptos and NFTs that are all the rage these days?
Well, I'm still trying to find a reason for their existence.
ONDC, the account aggregator, or the CBDC, what is the biggest game changer for India's digital journey going ahead?
Well, all of them, but I think democratization of credit through AA will allow millions of businesses to flourish. That's very important, and they'll create jobs.
We have the Infosys and the TCS and all the big IT companies of the world. We're still the back office of the world. What is it going to take for us to have Googles and Amazons and Facebooks out of India?
Well, I don't think we're just the back office. I mean, if you look at the work done by companies like Infosys, they're actually doing digital transformation for the world's largest companies. And that's actually the sweet spot for India. So I think it's perfectly good that in this sector we are the world leaders.
Okay, and lastly, because you are called the Chief Technology Officer and all things digital, what are some of your favorite apps? What are the apps on your phone that you use the most?
I keep my life very simple. I don't use any social media except Twitter to send stuff out.
Not even UPI payments on your phone?
I use UPI payments, and I use the DigiLocker to keep my documents.
Well, that was Nandan Nilekani on startups, on CBDC, on the data protection bill, and a whole lot more. But I also spoke with Professor Fleming, who is the chairperson of the NGO Unleash, which collaborated with Infosys to hold the Global Innovation Lab in their Mysore campus earlier this month. The idea is to bring together youth from around the world to come together and co-create ideas for a sustainable future. Have a look.
Well, I met Nandan down in World Economic Forum in January 2020, and I presented the idea of Unleash, and Nandan was very kind to say, I'd like to invite you here to Bangalore and to meet with me. And I met with Nandan in the late February 2020 and discussed the Unleash and so forth here. And I left India again thinking that we should come back in December 2020. But, Corona came and now we're here. And why here? Well, I mean, I'm truly amazed about Infosys. Infosys is a fantastic company, investing a lot of education of the youth here, but also a very sustainable company. And I must say that being here for a week here together with the talents, I mean, they love to be here. Most beautiful campus, most sustainable campus, excellent food, excellent environment. So we have a fantastic week here.
Well, I'll ask you some of the good ideas that have come in from this 1 week long event. What really stood out for you? Something you'd like to share?
I think maybe the most, although there's been a lot of fantastic solutions, maybe the most important thing for me is actually empowering these people here. We're going through this process of actually learning how to formulate a problem, going into ideation phase, prototyping, solving a problem, working together in a very diverse group, as Nandan is saying. So we're simply empowering them. So they will certainly keep working with their solution, but they will also go out and use that methodology either in their companies, in their startup companies, with NGOs, or in their small communities. And, this morning I met a lady who was born in a refugee camp in Syria. She managed to get education. She managed to go to UK for doing a master and PhD, and now she's developing a solution with wastewater, converting that into biofuel, which works in refugee camps, just to mention one solution here. So it's pretty amazing to see the energy and excitement for the young people.
Well, that was all the time we had today. Thank you for watching, and it's a goodbye from all of us.